If you know anything about Puyo Puyo as someone in an English-speaking territory, it's probably that official localizations of Puyo Puyo games and content is very few and far between. The more recent games have received worldwide releases, but for a long, long time, Sega completely ignored this franchise outside of Japan, and Compile wasn't big enough of a company to be able to support making localizations of their Puyo games on their own. Anyways, as with many localizations of games, things had to be changed to fit what the developers would think would be appropriate for other regions, for a variety of reasons. I thought it'd be fun to make a little video covering every localization for every Puyo game, as most of them have interesting localization tidbits to cover. This will, however, only cover actual Puyo localizations, not reskins. They're a whole other can of worms. Anyways, to begin, let me introduce the arcade version of Puyo Puyo 1. To summarize this version of the game, it seems that for a very long time, this localization was speculated to be a potential bootleg. There's three major factors that disprove this, however, two of them being that in an interview from the guidebook all about Puyo Puyo 2 that more or less directly refers to this localization, and the 2019 Sega Ages release of Puyo 1, which contained this localization. Anyways, this localization has some strange oddities in terms of what they chose to change rather than directly translate. What I'm referring to is the names of all the characters, which are almost all different to their Japanese names, which I'll go through now. Arul Naja is now Sylvana, Skeleton T is now just Skeleton, Nasu Grave is now Blue Ghost, I guess they didn't realize he was an eggplant, Mummy is still just Mummy, Draco Centauros is Dragon Woman, Skatadara is Gobby Captain, yeah, Tsukiopotes is Smallfoot, Harpy is Dark Elf, Sasori Man is Scorpion Man, which is just a literal translation of his name, Panotti becomes Johnny, Zombie is still Zombie, Witch is still Witch, Zor Daimao is now Elephant Lord, Sheza Wige is now Devious, Minotauros becomes Max Minotaur, Rulu becomes Lulu, and finally Satan becomes Dark Prince. Carbuncle remains Carbuncle too, however. Keep that Dark Prince one in mind though, as you'll see that name pop up in later games I mentioned in this video. The rest of these localized names are exclusive to this game and weren't used elsewhere. An interesting note is that Harpy's sprites were edited to remove her wings, likely due to religious reasons, which you can infer were the same reasons Satan's name was changed. Other than that, Arul is given a new English voice to replace her reused Mado Monogatari lines from the Japanese version, and...
You got me! Fire! Ice storm! Full power! Pew pew! Pew pew!
It's not the best. One more little thing of note is that this localization ends up not using a sprite of Satan, getting frustrated at Arul for mispronouncing his name, as the original dialogue in Japanese involves Arul confusing his name for Santa, which obviously wouldn't work anymore once his name was changed to Dark Prince. As for other localized versions of Puyo Puyo 1, the Game Gear version has one, technically. If you have a Japanese copy of the game and played in an English Game Gear, an English version of the game will play instead, interestingly. The title becomes Puzzlo Kids. Yeah, what a title. Anyways, as the title alludes to, the Puyos are called P-Kids in this localization. Everything in this is fully translated. It's kinda surreal to see, especially since it never actually got an official worldwide release and can only be played via a Japanese copy of the game. Anyways, despite the change in the name of the title and the Puyos themselves, one thing in common this has to the Puyo 1 arcade localization is that it also calls Satan Dark Prince, this being the third major piece of evidence that the Puyo 1 arcade English version was official. Anyways, that's all when it comes to localizations of Puyo 1, so it's time to talk about the localized versions of Puyo Puyo 2. There are three versions of Puyo Puyo 2 to talk about, the first being the Geo Pocket color version of the game from 1999, featuring the localized name of Puyo Pop. Not to be confused with the N-Gage game Puyo Pop, which is the only Puyo game to release in English countries only and not in Japan, and the Game Boy Advance game Puyo Pop, which is a game I'll be talking about later. Anyways, the most interesting points about this game come from not the game itself, but from the box and manual, so let's go through everything of interest. Duke it out with unique opponents like Walleye and Happy. Oh, how I appreciate the enthusiasm. The manual has some great stuff inside, such as Nostra Puyo foresees the number of Ojama that will fall in the field. Looks like they called the nuisance preview Nostra Puyo, and they called nuisance Puyos Ojama, in all caps. If you can't tell, they're directly translating Japanese names into English, which results in this nonsense-sounding gameplay description. If Puyo block the place where the other Puyo come out, the highest level of the third column from the left, it's game over, pal, and you lose. Thank you for the dramatic description. Here's the Puyo species page. Gotta love hard Puyo. I also appreciate this page showing different nuisance measurements, such as Puyo Runt and Puyo Brat. This art and spelling for Carbuncle here is funny. That's about it for the manual. As for the game itself, there's a few things of interest actually. The text above Nami says, here, which to give context for those unaware, Nami is a tiny flea character that's in Puyo Puyo 2, and always has the text, it is here, above him, so localizing it as just here is more than acceptable. The game still uses the Japanese voice clips of characters, something that surprisingly isn't the only game that I mentioned in this video that does this. A lot of names are kept the same as the Japanese version though, interestingly, with some exceptions. They butchered Oroko Sakana Bito's, aka Cyrilli's old name here. And of course, as was consistent with the arcade and Game Gear Puyo 1 translations, Satan is renamed Dark Prince. That's about it for Puyo Pop for the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Now onto the less interesting but still noteworthy localized versions of Puyo 2. This is the 3DS port of the Mega Drive version, released in 2016 as a part of Sega 3D Classics Collection. Sadly, the game itself is left untranslated, but the bottom screen's guide is at least. However, the manual is fully translated. It renames Satan a Dark Prince per tradition. For some reason, it makes a deep cut reference by mentioning the disc station game Rulu's Spring Break of Fists. They sure did their research. Also, the loading screen menu tips for the game are translated too, at least. Besides that, there's not too much else to say, so I'll mention the Sega Ages port of Puyo Puyo 2 now, which is a Nintendo Switch port of the arcade version of 2. Similar to the 3DS port, the game itself is untranslated. However, the menus are, as well as this new section that has character bios for every character. From my understanding, these are translations of the character bios found before you start each match in game, which is nice. And that's it for Puyo Puyo 2. And that's the last compiler of Puyo game that received any form of official translation. The next game, Puyo Pop for the GBA, was handled entirely by Sega, released in 2002. This game was called Minna de Puyo Puyo in Japan, which translates to Everybody Puyo Puyo. Firstly, the game doesn't translate the voice line, so everyone is still using their Japanese voices for this. In the Japanese version of the game, however, there's an option to switch the dialogue to English, and it's a very direct translation, complete with literally spelling out Kirby's name as Kakun. The translation in English copies of the game is polished from this version though, and yeah, there's honestly not much to say other than it's a pretty average localization in that regard. Any jokes that were difficult to translate are changed and whatnot, and character names in English are consistent with their Japanese names, with the exceptions of Minotauros simply becoming Minotaur, and yet again Satan becoming Dark Prince. Whether it be coincidence or series consistency on the developer's part, he still has this localized name throughout all these games. Now on to the next game, Puyo Pop Fever, first released in 2004. Puyo Pop Fever, I think, was Sega's first serious attempt to try and make Puyo successful outside of Japan. The game received a DS and GameCube release worldwide, as well as PS2, Xbox, PSP, and GBA ports in Europe. This is the first game mentioned here besides the arcade Puyo 1 localization to have translated voice acting, and it's alright. I don't know, some people seem to not like it very much, but for a game from 2004, I think the characters sound fine. There were certainly a few liberties taken when it came to the actual translations though. Just comparing character spells shows this. Bayon for Amity becomes alrighty, and for Arl it became cutie, as well as Diacute becoming Diamond Cutie. The story mode is filled with amusing lines that you can absolutely tell the translators just came up with. The most major localization changes that were made, I think, involve certain character names, and with Carbuncle. Certain characters received odd romanizations, and then there's Liddell. In Japanese, her name is pronounced Didadu, so the translators gave her the name Ryder. Yeah, whenever they give her an English name on Japanese stuff, this is the name they give her. However, they weren't even consistent with that. In-game, they also refer to her as Riedel and Rita. In Puyo Puyo Tetris, they finally gave her the name Liddell in English, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Also, they changed Carbuncle's Goose to Tada!
Ta-da! Ta-ta-da!
And I don't like that very much. I think honestly Puyo Pop Fever's localization and the game itself has enough interesting that it kinda warrants its own video, so maybe I'll make that eventually. After Puyo Pop Fever, Sega continued to make new Puyo games every couple of years, none of which received localizations. The most you'd hear out of Puyo in the West were the odd Sonic Runners collab and whatnot. However, in 2014, this little game called Puyo Puyo Tetris released in Japan, which received a sizable amount of people who desired a localization. So in 2017, it finally received that, and oh boy is there a lot to go over. I should get this out of the way firstly. Satan is still called Dark Prince in this. Amazingly, his localized name from back from the early 90s still prevails here all these years later. Anyways, besides a couple of spellings of some names being changed from Puyo Pop Fever, most stuff is kept pretty consistent with the Japanese version. One thing not consistent though is the voice actors. None of the returning characters have the same voice actors from Puyo Pop Fever. A couple of highlights of the new cast include Satan/Dark Prince being played by Xander Mobus, famous for playing the announcer in Smash 4 and Ultimate and Joker in Persona 5.
Are you even trying? Disaster, calamity, devastation, cataclysm, ascension!
And Margaro, Ekolo, and later Lagnus being played by Spike Spencer, famous for playing Shinji in the original dub of Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Try one of these! Ready for this? I'm not done yet!
The spells the characters say were given quite a few changes for most characters. Some changes were seemingly unnecessary, like Satan/Dark Prince's second spell being changed from Juggernaut to Calamity, and T's final spell being changed from T-Spin Burst to just Burst. But there was a different change that occurred as well, in regards to translating certain characters' spells. Now, if you're not aware, a lot of characters in Puyo Puyo have spells in English, even if the game is in Japanese. For example, Sig's spells in Puyo Tetris Japanese version are Cyan, Cerulean, Lapis Lazuli, Celestial, and Hydrangea, all of which are English words. Some characters, however, say words in other languages for their spells, such as Rafina and Lemris, who say theirs in French, and Klug, who says his in Latin. For Rafina and Klug, they actually kept their spells in the original languages for the English localization of Puyo Pop Fever, so if you play that game in English, Rafina and Klug's spells will be in French and Latin respectively. However, for this Puyo Puyo Tetris localization, they changed it so all their spells are in English. Why? Who knows, but it's a lame change, I think. That tangent aside, there were some other voice changes of note that they made, such as with the alt voices. For Sig, his alt voice in Japanese made him just say Shigu for all his lines like he's a Pokemon, but in the localization he just says his lines in an annoyed tone. Anyways, the other major point about this game is the story also takes some liberties for its dialogue, but in a more amusing way. What I mean is, the translation team had a field day with Shezo. Instances of him just saying, "I want you," in the original game were given more flair in the localization. Like with Puyo Pop Fever though, there's honestly enough more to talk about regarding Puyo Puyo Tetris 1's localization and the game itself that it could also be made into a video itself, so I'll stop myself for now and bring in the next game, Puyo Puyo Champions, released in 2019. In Japan, this game is called Puyo Puyo Esports due to the focus on the competitive side of the series for this entry. Since it's no secret though that Sega never acknowledges competitive Puyo in the West, the name change to Puyo Champions is warranted, I guess. Certain character name changes were introduced in this game, interestingly. Ciriri becomes Cirilli, which I very much prefer, and Lagnus becomes Ragnus, for which I have the opposite feelings for this change. There's a set of 4 alternate costume characters in the game Puyo Puyo 20th Anniversary themed around colours, those being Black Sig, Yellow Satan, Red Amity, and White Feli. However, all these names were changed for champions, except for Red Amity, making this set inconsistent now. Demon Servant, a pretty obscure compile-era character, also had his name changed to Demi-Surf, a reasonable change. Anyways, this game is consistent with character spells in Puyo Puyo Tetris' localization, as in, there's a few oddities. For example, one of Ragnus' spells, Mega Rave, which appeared in Puyo Puyo Sun and Mado Monogatari Saturn, as a move where he makes these large spheres of light energy to use as an attack, was localized as Mega Grave, rendering the spell not make any sense anymore. Anyways, the other major point I wanted to bring up with this localization is that some of the voice acting is kinda bad. Like, this is what Sig sounds like in Puyo Puyo Tetris.
Lapis Lazuli, Celadon, Cobalt. Hey, a Tetris. Let's do this.
And this is what he sounds like in Puyo Puyo Champions.
12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17.
Maybe they rushed the voice actors in this one in comparison to Puyo Puyo Tetris, who knows. Here's another example with Arul, Puyo Tetris.
Here I go! Want more? Attack! Counter! Fireball! Ice Storm! Mind Blast!
Versus Puyo Champions.
Fireball! Ice Storm! Mind Blast! Judgment!
Other than that, Puyo Puyo Champions doesn't have much else for me to say about its localization, so on to the final localized Puyo game, Puyo Puyo Tetris 2. Puyo Puyo Tetris 2 is very similar to the previous two games' localizations, but has some improvements and flaws in different areas. For one, characters that were added in this game that weren't playable in Puyo Puyo Tetris 1. A lot of these characters' spells are a lot more accurate to their Japanese originals. For one, Ragnus' Mega Grave was corrected to Mega Rave. And for Strange Klug, who had their name changed to Possessed Klug in Puyo Puyo Champions, which was carried over to this localization, they didn't have their final spell changed. It's Hydrangea like it is in Japanese. However, they didn't go back to the characters already in Puyo Puyo Tetris 1 and give them these improved translations of their spells. Sig still says Cobalt when he should be saying the same final spell as Possessed Klug. Speaking of inconsistencies, that point I mentioned about different language spells in the localization was rectified. So Liddell correctly says her spells in Italian, and Miss Accord correctly says hers in French. Another point of interest is that a lot of voice lines in battle of characters that were playable in Puyo Tetris 1 are reused from that game. It's especially noticeable for certain characters.
Victory! Counterattack! Fire Breath! Dragon Tail! Dragon Claw! Hear me roar! Inferno! A Tetris!
One more thing I wanted to say was this random flub. In both Puyo Puyo Tetris 1 and 2, there's these online greetings that you send before a match starts. In Puyo Puyo Tetris 2, they're voiced by the characters, which was something the first game didn't have. One of Arul's ones was, "It's you and me, Carby," which is a pretty close translation of what the original Japanese text said. This made sense since Arul and Carbuncle were together as one character in Puyo Tetris 1. This line was kept in the Japanese version of Puyo Tetris 2, which didn't make too much sense now since Carbuncle was a separate playable character from Arul in that game. And I guess they realized this for the localization, and they made Arul say this instead, though.
Goo 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 goo!
Peculiar. And with that, the video is done. How do I even want to close off this video? Well, I guess I'd want to state that a majority of Puyo games still don't have translation patches, because barely any have official translations to begin with. That's why you should all help me make a translation patch for Mado Monogatari for the Sega